Well, good morning, and welcome to ITIF's event on why the Bipartisan Innovation Act is crucial for U.S. national security. I'm Stephen Ezel, the Vice President of Global Innovation Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. Well, it was just over 2 years ago now, on May 21st, 2020, in fact, when the Senate introduced the Endless Frontiers Act, which called for $250 billion of investments, including $100 billion in funding for U.S. science, R&D, and industrial competitiveness, along with $50 billion to support U.S. semiconductor R&D and domestic production through the Creating Helpful Incentives to Produce Semiconductors for America, or CHIPS Act. Endless Frontiers ultimately became the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, USICA, which passed the Senate on a largely bipartisan 68-32 basis last June. Now, last fall, the House began work on companion legislation that would ultimately become the America Competes Act, which passed in February 2022 and included some $250 billion of investments and programs supporting U.S. R&D, innovation, industrial competitiveness, and national security. On May 16th of this year, a congressional conference represented by over 100 Congress members across the two houses and parties began work to reconcile the two pieces of legislation into now renamed Bipartisan Innovation Act, or BIA. But now, as we enter the summer months before a new election cycle, it's absolutely vital that Congress move with alacrity to pass a comprehensive BIA. And it's critical not just from an economic and industrial competitiveness standpoint, although that's crucial, but as we'll hear today, also a national security perspective, especially if the United States is to take seriously the economic and national security challenges that China increasingly poses. One reason the legislation is important is its call for $29 billion for a new National Science Foundation Technology Directorate that would really expand R&D funding into 10 key emerging technologies with significant national security and defense applications, such as AI, quantum, biotechnology, advanced batteries, clean energy, and hypersonics. Another reason this legislation is important is that it will arrest what is really significant continuing underinvestment at the federal level in U.S. R&D. In fact, just to return to the levels of federal funding of R&D as a share of GDP to where we were in 1983, we'd have to invest about $80 billion or more. This legislation all the way to arresting that significant underinvestment gap in R&D. Of course, another reason this legislation matters greatly is just supporting village legislation. With semiconductors absolutely foundational, virtually every product and defense system in the world today, of the United States both lead at the cutting edge of semiconductor design and production, but also produce a credible share of semiconductors. Unfortunately, America's share of global semiconductor production has fallen by 70% since 1990, from 37% of the world's global production then to just 12% today. So this legislation includes very important investments in the R&D and innovation side, keep America at the cutting edge of semiconductor innovation, but the $39 billion development and other activities to support the semiconductor-related needs of the Department of Defense and the intelligence community. But there are many other defense and national security-related elements of legislation. For instance, America Competes calls for a defense supply chain risk management review, which mirrors Section 3232 of USICA, which calls for a report on how to strengthen America's national technology and industrial base. Other elements of legislation include provisions to build up allied defensive capabilities in the Indo-Pacific, to counter China's proliferation of ballistic missile and nuclear technology, to enhance American research security and integrity, and to enhance America's biodefense preparedness. In other words, the Bipartisan Innovation Act is as crucial for America's national security as it is for its economic security, and therefore it's imperative that Congress pass this legislation this summer. With that introduction, let me introduce the all-star panel we have with us today, and note that at the end of the presentations, we'll take questions from the audience via the Slido application, which can be found on the event webpage at both the ITIF website and on YouTube. First today, we'll hear from Dr. Arthur Herman. Dr. Herman is a senior fellow and director of the Quantum Alliance Initiative at the Hudson Institute, where his research programs analyze defense, energy, and technology issues. Dr. Herman is a regular newspaper and magazine columnist, from commentary to the Wall Street Journal, and the author of 9 books, including the truly excellent Freedom's Forge: How American Business Produced Victory in World War II. Dr. Herman holds a PhD in History and Classics from Johns Hopkins University. Next, we'll hear from Michael Brown, who is director of the Defense Innovation Unit, the DIU, at the Department of Defense, which he joined after a 2-year stint as a White House Presidential Innovation Fellow at the DoD. Before he joined government service, Michael served as CEO of Symantec Corporation and as chairman and CEO of Quantum Corporation. Michael holds a BA in economics from Harvard and an MBA from Stanford. Next, we're honored to be joined by Dr. Evelyn Levine, who was the co-founder and chief science officer at America's Frontier Fund, a nonprofit deep tech fund focused on securing the technology, leadership, and collective prosperity of America and its partner nations. Evelyn previously served as a lead physicist in the Emerging Technologies Group at the MITRE Corporation. She holds a research associateship in the Department of Physics at Harvard University, from which she earned a PhD in applied physics. Lastly, we'll hear from Lieutenant General Jack Shanahan, who retired in 2020 after a 36-year military career with the U.S. Air Force, where he served in missions from intelligence to flying. In his final assignment, he served as the inaugural director of the U.S. Department of Defense Joint Artificial Center. He is now an adjunct senior fellow with the Center for New American Security and a 2022 graduate of the North Carolina State University Masters of International Studies program. So with that, let me turn the conversation over to our panelists, beginning with Dr. Arthur Herman. Arthur, thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephen. Hello, everybody. This has been, like you, Stephen, I recognize this is kind of a landmark event, having a bill that does all of the different things that this one does at the stage in which it's ready to be passed by both houses of Congress and signed by the president. And like you, Stephen, I've been an interested and sometimes frustrated observer as I've watched Congress struggle with the issues that are contained in this bill over the last couple of years. Watch them struggle with the CHIPS Act, watch Endless Frontiers Act, any number of iterations of legislative will, which just didn't really sort of seem to arrive at a stage at which things could actually get done and funding could finally be found. With this version, the Bipartisan Innovation Act, looks like we are going to have some funding, and we are going to have some funding flowing in some very useful and important channels. You summarized some of the key provisions of that. Let me just reiterate from where I am and thinking about the role of government in encouraging an industrial economy and a manufacturing economy to gear up, not just in order to create jobs, but also to defend and secure national security. That's what my book, Freedom's Forge, is all about. How do you do that? How does government ramp up industrial production in ways that really make America strong and secure, and also secure our allies? And there's a lot of good things going on in this Innovation Act that I think make it a candidate for passage and finally signature. One of them is, as you point out, the amount of money that's going to be flowing from the government directly into R&D. This is one of the things that government does best, is to support basic research and development. And the National Science Foundation makes an excellent channel in which to see that funding flow out, and also to see that kind of research pay off in ways that are very, very difficult to foresee, both in terms of economic security and national security. Let's think back to 1994, when the National Science Foundation provided funding to 2 Stanford University graduates to look at ways in which they could monitor and keep track of website activity on what was then the nascent World Wide Web. Well, that money, the funding that went into that process, the grant that they received, wound up providing the foundations for Google. Not a bad return on investment for that kind of money for a research and development project. And so seeing this bill from the point of view of what government can do best, funding research and development, I would say this is a really good thing that's happening there. I'd also say that with regard to the provisions and for the final amount of money that's going to be spent to help to resuscitate and to revive our semiconductor industry. We've really learned over the last year and a half just how crucial it is to have a strong microchip industry and to have supply chains in that industry that are able to support economic growth and to maintain national security at the same time. And I have to say, when you look at the price tag which is attached to that, about what, $39 billion. It was $50 billion in the original Senate version here, at a time when Congress, the administration, are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars for other kinds of initiatives on the congressional docket. You have to say that spending $39 billion looks very cost conscious, even prudent by comparison with the way in which spending has been going into other aspects of government programs and development there. And then finally, I think too, the money that's going to be set aside for the development of ways in which to keep track of supply chains, that we've come to understand that the issue of securing and maintaining resilient and trusted supply chains is a national security issue, as well as one for economic security. This is an overdue priority for government, and again, a very important, legitimate part of what government should be doing in approaching this issue and taking it on. Now, I'll just point out two other things with regard to the Innovation Act that we must keep track of, and that I think, and here maybe I'll say more about this later, why this is really only, and really should be, only the first step in terms of developing a strong American all-of-government response, not just to the threat of China, but also reviving our industrial and manufacturing base. The first is that with issues of supply chains, with issues about semiconductors, with questions of R&D, let's be honest, all of this is about confronting the enormous challenge that China represents to us. Once we have a very clear and are transparent about what our real target is, and that is of competing and prevailing against China, then I think it'll make it easier, not just to build a strong bipartisan support for this, but to make the public understand why a bill of this sort is so necessary here. And at a time when China is spending trillions of dollars on these very same technologies, like artificial intelligence, like quantum, like biotech, and strong arming China's private sector into spending hundreds of billions of dollars as well, the money that we're setting aside here can only rank as a first step. The second one I'll mention very briefly, which again I hope we'll have time to talk about, is the issue of security. That whatever kinds of programs are set up today, which has any kind of role having to do with cyber or with internet or with questions of data, security questions have to be paramount. And one of the things which I think that we need to address in order to really make this Innovation Act into a really important part of rebuilding our strong industrial and manufacturing base, including semiconductors, has got to be riders that are attached to make sure that our intellectual property and our data flowing from these activities and from our efforts here are going to be secure and are going to be safe and are free from the prying eyes and predatory practices of a country like China, If we don't do that, if we don't pay attention to the security issues that are involved with all of these aspects, then we're going to be in some serious trouble. And a lot of our efforts are going to be wasted in this area. So this is an important bill, I think, both from a economic security point of view, but also from a national security point of view, especially with regard to our defense industrial base. And I think the person who can say a lot more about this and the implications of the Innovation Act for our defense industrial base now and in the future is probably my fellow panelist, Michael Brown. So Michael, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Arthur. And thank you, Stephen, for having me today. As you mentioned, my day job is the director of the Defense Innovation Unit at the U.S. Department of Defense. But I think it's important to say that my comments here don't reflect those of the Defense Department. They're purely my own. Well, Arthur, I think you did a fantastic job of sharing why this is historic legislation. I certainly agree with your comments. This is really a down payment for what the U.S. needs to do in thinking about the strategic competition with China, which now we are calling a peer competitor to the U.S. and our pacing threat in the Defense Department. And if we look at what China has done, they're really using all instruments of national power to ensure that technology is the underpinning for economic growth, which many would say is really the bargain that China has made with its people. If it can ensure economic growth, then it gets to remain in power. And if it jeopardizes that, maybe the regime is more precarious. So we can certainly understand with that as a backdrop why China is so focused on ensuring that it's increasing its R&D intensity of its economy, and it is at the forefront of many technologies. Really the first time the U.S. has been challenged effectively for its supremacy in technology since World War II. The Soviets certainly mounted a challenge, but we know from the historical data they were never really that close because they weren't a large enough economy to be challenging us. And they had many other issues as well. So this is critical for both our economic and national security for the next several decades as we look out. I think, Stephen, as you pointed out, the origin of this is the Endless Frontiers Act. And I think it's important to think about that. Really goes to the historical importance of Vannevar Bush and his work to make sure that the U.S. remained on the forefront in science and technology after World War II. And we saw a key advantage that we had was the investment in basic research. So this is trying to return us to the level of investment that will ensure that we continue to make progress as a society in science and technology. And in any look at the competition with China, you immediately come to the conclusion that it's not about what defensive measures we take, and we've taken some of those already, but it's about what we do to improve our own prospects, our own economic and national security by the investment we make in ourselves. That's going to be the difference. It made the difference in winning the Cold War with the Soviets. It will make the difference in terms of making sure that the U.S. remains competitive economically and secure and secure from a national security standpoint. So I think this is a down payment. If we were, you mentioned, Stephen, 80 billion it would take if we returned to the level of government-funded R&D from the 1980s. 200 billion is the number if we got back to the 1960s, where we really were in a full-on competition with the Soviets. So this really is a down payment of what we will need to be spending over the next decades to make sure at the forefront of these next set of technologies that we've talked about here that are referenced in the bill: artificial intelligence, biotech, autonomy, et cetera. So I couldn't feel more strongly about the fact that this bill is necessary. It's necessary to pass now, and it's necessary to think about what are some of the follow-on steps. A number of folks since the 1980s, when we had the shareholder revolution and the Milton Friedman School, would say the private sector should be taking care of all of this. But I think what we have realized since then is the private sector does not take care of all this. The private sector takes care of what is in its own interest to make profit, which has increasingly moved the U.S. economy to software and services. Fantastic that we have comparative advantage, and we should reinforce that comparative advantage. But what we see that we miss if we leave this all to the market is we don't make the long-term investments, we don't make the riskier investments, and increasingly we don't make the hardware investments. All of those are critical for economic and national security. The example that Arthur gave, while a software example in Google, really underscores how important it is for government to undertake that research. If the government hadn't worked on the World Wide Web, which you could say came out of DARPA research, then Google would not be able to have the incredible business model that it has today. And I think if you look back at a number of the investments that government has made, where we're willing to make the longer term, riskier investments, they end up, when they're successful, providing a foundation for entirely new industries, as Google has shown us. So I think that's why this government research is important to make those longer term, riskier investments that allow us to be preeminent in terms of basic research and technological development. That is what ensures our economic and national security over the long term. Let me just address the military implications for a minute. The military increasingly needs commercial technology. So if we go back 50, 60 years, the Pentagon was doing a lot of the R&D work for technologies it, in fact, would need. Semiconductors traces its history back to the Defense Department, which needed semiconductors. We needed it for the space program. We needed it to miniaturize electronics for nuclear weapons. That ended up developing the semiconductor industry. So another example of where government research is important to really build a foundation for future industries that grow and add to our economic prosperity. But if we look today, the difference between the military from the 1970s today, most of the critical technology we need is commercial. My boss, the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, just put together a list of 14 technologies critical to national security, most of which are covered here in this bill. 80% of those are commercially led, meaning the private sector is leading the technology development for those. So from a pure military standpoint, we need the advanced technologies coming from the commercial sector, and we need the basic research that allows for these new industries and companies to build upon those that then the military will use for applications. So very important to ensure the currency of military technology, or the modernization of the Defense Department, that we have access to those technologies. And those technologies will not be leading if the US isn't leading in those technologies. This is a step in that direction. Nothing could be more important of those technologies than kind of the basic foundation for all of these that we're talking about: AI, autonomy, biotech, et cetera. They all have a foundation on chips or semiconductors. So let me turn it over now to my fellow panelist and a friend who is an expert in this area and can talk about the implications of the Embedded Chips Act within Endless Frontiers, and that's Dr. Edlin Levine. Edlin?
Thank you very much, Mike, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to Stephen and the ITIF team for pulling this tremendous panel together to discuss this incredibly important topic today. As Mike said, I do want to focus on the CHIPS element of the America Competes Act, which is focused on investing in the US's competitiveness in the semiconductor industry. And to begin with, it's important to realize both what the CHIPS Act is and what it is not. The CHIPS Act does not address a lot of the root causes for why the US lost and is losing our manufacturing and technology competitiveness in semiconductors. But what it is an opportunity to invest US taxpayer funding into activities that actually grow our economy and catalyze continued economic competitiveness in advanced technologies. And that's fundamental because of the role that advanced technologies, disruptive technologies play in stimulating economic growth that we've seen over the past century. And that's certainly, the Endless Frontiers Act was actually the call that Mike Brown had mentioned, referencing Vannevar Bush's reference to science and basic science as the endless frontier for the United States. And certainly the fund that I've co-founded, America's Frontier Fund, is named after that very same frontier of advanced technologies that is so foundational to competitiveness from an economic growth perspective as well as a national security perspective. The United States today is still a leader in semiconductors, and it's important to realize that what the CHIPS Act provides is an opportunity to further that leadership and ensure that we don't lose that leadership as we've lost in many other technology sectors like photovoltaics, batteries, et cetera, that where the US used to be a leader, we are now subsequently not because we have not made the proper policy decisions to continue to compete in those advanced technologies. As Mike had said, a lot of the optimization that industry makes by itself is for near-term profits, and companies around the world are global entities that will optimize for location of manufacturing and advanced research where it's economically favorable, not where it's favorable from an economic and national security perspective for a specific country to begin with. So that's important to realize about the private sector. US manufacturing capacity in semiconductors is declining across all segments of memory, logic, and analog, despite the fact that every single one of these segments from a capacity perspective is growing worldwide. China, in contrast, is set to nearly double its capacity over the next 10 years to roughly 30% of all global semiconductor manufacturing capacity. Last I saw numbers from the Semiconductor Industry Association was that China has over 70 fab projects that are currently underway or planned, where fabs are fabrication facilities for semiconductors. So it's important to realize that A, this technology is important. B, the United States does need to actively compete, does need to have public-private cooperation between government and industry, and does actually need to make the significant investments that are necessary. Now, I do want to touch on both of the points that I had said, what CHIPS is not, and then what CHIPS is, and click into each of those with a little bit more detail. CHIPS, I mentioned, does not address the root causes for lack of U.S. competitiveness. The industry, the semiconductor industry, was born in the United States. 1948 was the initial discovery of the transistor at AT&T Bell Labs. And that subsequently grew a domestic industry, which was the sole industry in the United States. So the inception and growth of the early days of the semiconductor industry was solely an American affair. The question becomes, what happened? How did it globalize? Why did it globalize? What were the drivers? And they are economic and cost drivers. The cost of ownership of a fab today is predicted to be about 40 to 70% higher in the US than in China. So from a business perspective, why would you build a fab in the United States? It doesn't make economic sense. Those cost drivers have not been addressed in a large part in the bill. There's a high cost of labor in the United States. There are higher corporate taxes. There's a high cost of land, construction, supporting infrastructure that's necessary for these fabrication facilities. And recognize that time is also money for a lot of these companies. And there's a prohibitive regulatory framework in the United States that has long approval times as opposed to shorter approval times in other regions in the world, particularly Asia. There are other elements to competitiveness that, from a holistic perspective, need to be considered for any high-tech industry, and those include immigration and our ability to attract and retain top talent from around the world, elements of export control and antitrust regulation, which is a bit of a tip of the iceberg, but understanding that a lot of those have double-edged swords in terms of the outcomes that they have for technology competitiveness. CHIPS, as Arthur had mentioned, is not a long-term bill. It is, it's either 50 billion, 52 billion, 39 billion, however many, depending on which version you're looking at, that's invested over 5 years. But this is, technology development, deep tech, takes much longer than 5 years to actually mature and catalyze. We're in also a great power marathon, which is certainly not going to end in 5 years, but is actually going to extend decades out into the 21st century. So we have to realize that CHIPS should be viewed as the beginning, not the be-all and end-all of U.S. activities that need to stimulate our competitiveness. Now, let me talk about the opportunity that CHIPS actually presents. What I was just saying is what CHIPS is not. What CHIPS is a potential catalyst for U.S. competitiveness in deep technologies. It's an acknowledgement of the fundamental role that technologies play in economic growth. You can think of technology as the X factor in the economist's growth equation. It's not simply, economic growth is not simply a function of capital and labor. Technology advancement is absolutely fundamental because new technologies are what stimulate the unknowns of market growth. If you think back to 1948, we could not have predicted, for example, the social mobile internet that was driven by cell phones that are, fundamentally rooted in the compute power that are enabled by transistors. The inventors of the transistor in 1948 couldn't have predicted the trillions of dollars of market growth that the semiconductor foundation laid for the entire world. And that's important to realize with regard to disruptive technologies. also realize that right now is a very exciting time in the semiconductor industry from a technology point of view. Devices have never been as complex as they are today. And, today manufacturers are able to, cram as many as 10 to the 10 transistors on single chips, which is a huge, tremendous feat in human engineering. If you think about it, that is a modern marvel and one of the most complex manufacturing processes that humanity has ever come up with. But the reason I say it's exciting is that actually this industry is ripe for disruption. Some of you might have heard of the end of Moore's law, which is an economic law or economic trend, which says that a number of transistors will essentially double every 2 years, which then also relates to the compute performance of chips, that you're going to have a continued increase of compute in terms of the capabilities that are afforded. That's, some people will say, coming to an end. But from a technologist point of view, an end means a beginning. It means an opportunity to create more. And certainly when you look at the technologies, the emerging technologies in semiconductors, there's a lot there, which is exciting. New materials, new process technologies, design tools, heterogeneous integration, and advanced packaging. All of that, all of those technologies that are emerging are going to be the drivers of the future. And so if we think about the CHIPS Act, the CHIPS Act is not meant to be a subsidy and shouldn't be constructed as a subsidy for the established incumbents of industry. Rather, what it should do is stimulate the growth of new technologies and ensure that the United States leads in those technologies. What does that mean for the United States? It means that the bill should be structured such as to foster competition of ideas, a marketplace of ideas, enable risk takers to actually take those risks and do so in the United States in terms of scaling new technologies. The bill also presents an opportunity to reduce what are currently formidable barriers to commercializing new process technologies in the United States. So what that means today, what the paradigm currently is that the United States still is an engine of invention. But when it comes to scaling innovations and commercializing them, many US innovators move offshore. And that's the trend that we need to stop. We actually want those innovators to stay in the United States. And we need to then, underwrite the risk of technology development. Today, it is extremely expensive for technology to actually be developed specifically in this industry, which has high cost barriers to entry. And so the CHIPS Act enables an investment, a down payment of the risk that essentially offsets what a company might consider as a disincentive. Companies are usually good at exploiting existing technologies rather than exploring what might be truly revolutionary and new technologies, which is where we want this industry to focus today in the United States. And so we can't only seek investments that are captured by incumbency. What we want to do, and this is fundamental, is to actually drive and create new industries, right? Drive the investment the same way that a venture capitalist will invest in new technologies and new industries. We want this funding to essentially be the way that the United States will invest in the technologies of the future. So it's absolutely important, right? Going back to the premise of the talk, it's absolutely important that the funding pass. Now is the time to do so. We need to be moving forward and accelerating, not slowing down and waiting due to political interests and so forth. I would encourage everyone to consider what is at stake here in terms of US competitiveness, to realize that we've lost in other industries that we've previously led in, and now is the time to lead in semiconductors, and to do so by investing in the types of activities that stimulate new technologies and new market growth. Many thanks. And now I have the honor of handing over to my fellow panelist, Lieutenant General Jack Shanahan, for his comments as well.
Thank you, Edelyn. Thanks very much. And good morning to all of you. I am honored and delighted to join my fellow panelists for this incredibly important conversation. Globally, we have already entered an era that history is going to characterize accurately, in my opinion, as being as consequential as the agrarian and industrial revolutions. What do I mean by that? What we're seeing is a monumental shift from an industrial age hardware-centric model. And that model is national security, that model is economic competitiveness, you name it. It's a hardware-centric industrial age model. And we're seeing this monumental shift to a digital or information age software-centric model. Any state that is capable of adapting to this digital age faster and more broadly than its competitors is expected to gain a major, perhaps even decisive competitive advantage, not just over the long term, but probably over the short term as well, which is why this is a clarion call to action for the United States. We have to embrace this transition to this information or digital and software-centric age. It's not going to happen by itself. The mistake we make too often is that status quo is acceptable, that past performance is a solid indicator of future results, and it's anything but. If the United States wants to maintain its global leadership position, national security, economic competitiveness, climate, you name it. If we want to maintain that global leadership position, this is the future we need to embrace. Put China aside for a second and just say, for the United States' economic well-being and its national security, we have to embrace the future that is already upon the rest of the world. The fact that China is embracing it, the fact that China is investing as much in these technology focus areas as the United States only adds a sense of urgency to what we need to do and how fast we need to move. Stephen said at the very beginning, and it's the word that I'll repeat now, is alacrity. We can't afford to kick the can down the road a little bit longer because it will just work itself out. This is about being proactive as a nation. It's not just about the Department of Defense, it's not about the Department of Energy, it's not about the NSF. It's about society writ large and the United States entering to the next 10 to 25 years as the global leader in the digital age. And so I'll just spend a moment talking about the 10 technology focus areas that are in the Bipartisan Innovation Act that came out of the USICA. These are important, and they range on one end from artificial intelligence, machine learning, autonomous systems, high performance computing, quantum information science, all the way to the other end of data storage, advanced energy, advanced material science. Each one of those technologies by itself is critical to the United States gaining this competitive or maintaining its competitive advantage in this digital future. When put together, it really provides the blueprint, a foundation for the United States to accelerate into the digital age. This is about acceleration. This isn't about we'll figure it out. We're good. We've always done it this way. The challenge that China presents nationally that have embraced this from President Xi Jinping down to the lowest village level, they're in. This is the direction they want to go. These 10 technology focus areas are designed to maintain the United States competitive advantage. And the thing I probably want to emphasize more than anything else about these 10 focus areas and technologies, they're not meant to compete with the core mission of the National Science Foundation of basic research, right? It's been a world renowned leader in basic research forever and will continue to be a world leader in basic research. What this is designed to be is complementary to that core mission of basic research. This is about applied research and commercial applications. And I go back to what Mike Brown said when he talked. Now, this is experience that I live firsthand. If you look at the cycle today of technology from concept to design development to fielding sustainment, that cycle has only accelerated over the course of the last year. It's really gotten tighter and tighter as a cycle. I don't think we should expect anything else other than that's going to continue to accelerate over the course of the next few years and go even faster and faster from somebody has an idea to when something is fielded. And Vannevar Bush, who I admire probably more than anybody else, who understood sort of how to make this combination of industry, commercial industry, government, and academia work. His focus really was on basic research. But what we've seen in technology is we don't have 5 years or 10 years to react. We have like months and maybe a couple of years to bring these technologies in. So to me, these 10 technology areas are so complementary to NSF's basic mission of basic research and about commercial applications. So as I live this firsthand, when I stood up 2 AI organizations, fielding organizations in the Department of Defense, Project Maven, and then a couple of years after that, the Joint AI Center, or the JAIC. The philosophy I embrace, and even in retirement, I've done nothing that's changed, nothing I've seen has changed my mind, was a commercial first philosophy. The technology exists. There's incredible technologies in the Department of Defense and the research laboratories. They just weren't ready to be fielded in the near term. By near term, I'm talking about months, 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, maybe up to a year. Not something that would be ready in 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So we went with a commercial first philosophy, and it was the only way we put our first artificial intelligence models out in a combat zone 6 months after we stood up the organization. I don't think that's kind of unheard of in Department of Defense. I would consider that being done at light speed. So this, to me, this idea of complementarity is basic research, applied research, and then how quickly can you really move and put these things into the future for the United States. This already been said already, but in terms of what these technologies will do for the United States, we're seeing a blurring of lines between economic security, national security. They're all coming together. And how we bring those different fields and embrace those different fields sort of simultaneously is what I think will make the difference between U.S. being the global leader, not just in technology, but in national security, and being seen as that beacon of democratic values for the rest of the world. This is what's so important about those 10 technology areas. So to me, this is a future of digital modernization. The technology is an extremely important part of this. But the other thing I think what we'll see that comes out of this act is putting a lot more emphasis on the digital modernization of the enabling functions that are so crucial to making that technology work as advertised, right? This is I guess I'd say it's building a new foundation for the United States of America that is based on digital modernization. The commercial companies are doing it. The industry's there. Academia is writing about it, thinking about it, and working with commercial industry. Now it's time to bring in the government to make this a whole of government and whole of society capability with these technologies. So I guess what I'll say to before I turn it back over to Stephen is there is no time to waste on this. I'll repeat what I said and I stole from Stephen. The idea of alacrity. Status quo is going to be the worst possible answer. The faster this bill can pass, the faster we can get to work on the basic research, on the applied research, on the commercial applications, and making sure that the United States of America is prepared for a future which will be unlike anything we've experienced in the past and will be as consequential as the agrarian and industrial revolutions. We don't have a choice. China is right there, breathing down our necks, so to speak. So for our own benefit, but also in terms of our long-term competitiveness, we have to do this as quickly as possible. With that, Stephen, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Jack, and to all of our panelists today. As we bring them all back for our Q&A period, want to remind the audience that we would like to receive your questions via the Slido application found on our event webpage and on the YouTube webpage. You can also feed questions via our hashtag ITIF Innovation Act on Slido and Twitter. So look forward to receiving your questions. But before we do that, let me just ask the panelists if there was anything you heard from one of your colleagues that you would like to comment or expand upon.
I can, my mic's on, I think it is.
Yes.
I was very pleased about Edlin's presentation about the Semiconductor Industry and CHIPS Act. You know, I've been writing about America's semiconductor industry under threat in my Forbes column for a couple of years now. And one of the things that more than 2 years ago, talking about the possibilities of the CHIPS Act and what could be done, and then watching it kind of stall out in the Senate and money that was supposed to go in being taken out. It was just very, very frustrating because it is such a central American industry for economic security, but also national security. I would add one thing that I think, and as we start thinking about, and in my mind as we're talking about this, and thinking about the political battle that may be still ahead with regard to passage, is, well, if we can convince Republicans not to slow roll this, right, and to try and do this in the next Congress, but get it done now, what could they do next, right? Because it's just a first step. Well, one, I would just mention, one of the key emphasis here in terms of semiconductor industry, where again, we face enormous challenge, I know Edlin agrees with me, is in semiconductor manufacturing equipment, where we see the Chinese have really understood how vital it is to have control over IP and facilities for the manufacturing of semiconductors and microchips as well. You know, in World War II, in order to carry out the wartime ramp up of tanks and ships and airplanes that was required to win World War II. The very first battle was over the machine tools. That if you didn't have the machine tools, you couldn't have an arsenal of democracy. It wasn't possible. Well, also too, I think in the semiconductor industry, if you don't have the machine tools, the equipment, and the IP and innovation taking place there, then the battle over a semiconductor industry and so on is going to go to those who do have control and who do understand those elements here. So here's a big opportunity for somebody to come along and say, okay, the CHIPS Act is great and we're happy to pass it, but now let's take it to the next stage. Let's look even deeper into the issue here, and that is how do we make sure that the chip manufacturing is also something in which America leads and works with trusted allies in the process.
Mike.
Yeah, so I'd like to foot stomp Jack's comment about alacrity. I mean, when I step back and look at the competition with China, I think we're just starting to come to grips with it. We're not moving with the sense of urgency that our economic prosperity for the next several decades depends on it. So it's really a emphasis on how fast we need to be moving. As Jack said, we would need to make these steps to make sure the U.S. is well positioned for the next several decades. But China breathing down our neck creates an additional sense of urgency to move quickly. Just one other dimension that as the conversation has progressed, it made me think of, and that's the important role of norms and standards in the world. One of the things that is at question right now is which model of economic development and governance will be the premier model. She is arguing that the authoritarian role that China is playing is the model, and he's certainly been emboldened after the financial crisis of 2008 to be increasingly touting his model versus the U.S. model. And of course, we very much hold dear the values embodied in our own model. Some would call it the liberal world order that's enabled peace and respect for nations' rights. One of the things that we gain with that and the technology supremacy that we've had for so long now being challenged is the ability to set norms and standards that reinforce democratic values, democratic small d. And if we're not on the forefront of technology, if we're not out front with many of these technologies, we're not going to be setting the standards. And you could argue that over the last few years, we've really let our leadership position in standard setting lapse.
Right.
China's very aggressive here, knowing that it's important to set the standards so their companies are at an advantage. I read something I can't attribute to where that China is now saying that third-rate companies build products, second-rate companies are industry leaders, first-rate companies set standards. So they're very focused on the fact that if they can be in a position with technology leadership to set standards, they really create the norms in the world of how technology can be used. And we know all technology can be used for good or for ill. And if we let that lapse and we're not at the table at the forefront, we're not going to like the consequences.
And Stephen, if I might jump in on something, such an important insight from Arthur on sort of that first battle in World War II on machine tools. And the question we all ask ourselves is, what's the machine tool equivalent of the future? And to me, it's bringing back. I'm not going to be the person that cries for the halcyon days of the past. However, the idea of commercial industry, academia, and government working together makes the difference. And we've had some setbacks in this area, as I experienced very personally in working with commercial tech companies that showed we still have some challenges in sort of how the three areas work together. But if we expect to enter this digital modernization era and do so successfully, it really is figuring out how industry, academia, and the government can work together to define a little bit of what that machine tooling looks like if most of these technologies might be coming out of commercial industry, especially as we look at those 10 technology focus areas. That by itself will spin off all sorts of ideas and technologies that will help us understand what we really need to build that are the machine tool equivalents to the World War II capital investment. And as Mike said, this is so important as well, is a battle of digital authoritarianism versus liberal democratic values. Both of those are extremely important. So this standards and governance piece of it is as important as the machine tools. It all has to be done quickly and done together. And that's the way I look at it. So thanks.
And don't forget, when it came to that machine tools and how basic and fundamental they were to wartime production, the machine tools was not a fixed feature. They were constantly evolving and innovating as well. And that's one of the other things that I think we also, that again, would be an important part of broadening out the discussion and bringing in a more participatory model for all of this. And that is, Heidi Shyu, our Undersecretary for Research and Engineering, has talked about the need for innovation in creating an innovation ecosystem. Well, I think it's also important that we work on developing and manufacturing in an ecosystem. That it is the case, in some ways, sadly, where the software development flows out of our commercial centers of innovation and change, but the hardware part of it is relegated to what the government can do or what the government can subsidize and so on. I think in the last 20 years, 30 years even, there's been way too much emphasis on software as the fount of innovation and change and development, and not enough emphasis on hardware and on manufacturing as being one of the key components, not just for economic security, but also for national security. And there's many reasons why this has happened, why this shift has taken place, which we can go into. But I think the most important thing is that the Chinese understand that, don't they? They know how crucial it is to have a strong manufacturing industrial base, including in these advanced technologies in areas like AI and quantum and advanced materials, et cetera, et cetera. Go through the whole list, right? The whole list. Manufacturing hardware is important to it. And that's a major source of jobs. It's a major source of what it is to be an American, I think. I mean, American is and used to be about making things, right? Pride in workmanship and so on. That's an important cultural roots that I think, and quality that can be brought out, that could also, I think, is also going to be important for getting us up to speed on digital. And I love Jack's expression, the digital modernization, but it also is going to have to include the digital modernization of how we make things, as well as how we create software or innovate in the digital space alone.
Arthur, one thing that I'd like to add on top of what you and Jack were saying is the fundamentally linked aspect between manufacturing and innovation. Manufacturing and research and development are not decoupled from each other. And that's an opportunity that this bill actually enables. If we think that we're on the cusp of Cambrian era for new materials that might be fundamental to advancing the next generation of information and computing systems beyond complementary metal oxide semiconductor technologies, we're going to have an ability to transfer them from just their ideas in, say, a university laboratory into high volume manufacturing. And from a researcher's perspective, from a technologist's perspective, the challenge that it takes to do something once, first proof of principle, is different than the technology challenge of doing it a million or billion times, which is what high volume manufacturing has done. If you think about the fact that we're able to do atomic scale manufacturing, which is relevant not just for semiconductors, but also for all quantum-based technologies, we're in a stage where we don't only do that for single devices, we're able to do that at scale for billions of devices. You think about the fact that there are over 1 million wafer starts per month in Taiwan, right? That's a tremendous amount of semiconductor output from that single country. And they're able to do it at high yield and high quality. So I want to double down and emphasize the fact that manufacturing and research and development go hand in hand. The United States has made a bet, and it's been an unconscious bet, but it's been the optimization of, in the case of semiconductors, a multi-trillion-dollar industry over the course of several decades to outsource manufacturing. What we think as the United States has been, we can be a consumer economy and a design economy and a digital economy without actually owning the manufacturing and still be able to lead in research. And we're going to have that bet come to a fore, because that's actually not the case. You have to have research with manufacturing and manufacturing with research. Research without manufacturing is a bridge to nowhere. and manufacturing without research is going to become outdated within a matter of 2 years, 1 year in the case of the semiconductor industry. And so it's absolutely foundational and
I
fundamental.
couldn't agree more. And again, thinking ahead, this is just first step, right?
Yeah. Well,
There's more to come, and focusing on precisely on these kinds of points of emphasis,
yeah,
which government can play an important role. And you always
right.
have to remember too, and remind ourselves, government doesn't create anything,
Yeah.
right? Government can only channel or impede the resources and energies that are already out there, and the knowledge that's already out there.
I would add that government can catalyze knowledge and growth, right, through the types of investments. I do want to say though, Arthur, to that point, you had mentioned the capital equipment industry for semiconductors. The United States, our industry still leads in that area, but realize that we're at risk in the sense of continued leadership, not only because of proactive policies on the part of China, but also proactive policies on the part of the United States. One example that I like to give in the context of historical examples is that as of 1980, the U.S. capital equipment market, right, our industry accounted for 90% of global capital supply for that type of tooling. But because of impacts of export controls in the 1979 Export Control Act, we had a decline in our market share from about 90% to below 50%. And we had supply chains outside the United States, particularly competition from that era from Japan and Japanese capital equipment suppliers that then stole market share from the United States. So the risk when it comes to designing policy for the government, and to your point, right, the government can act negatively toward technologies, really trying to act positively toward our competitiveness. We also saw impacts, right? There's export control. You saw impacts of the antitrust and approvals for certain mergers and acquisitions. The Netherlands has had a tremendous impact in terms of their acquisition of EUV lithography because we had approvals for their
That was
acquisition
exactly the example I was thinking.
and Silicon Valley Group. Similarly, though, we've had the U.S. Department of Justice block, for example, potentially Applied Materials acquiring Tokyo Electron, or NVIDIA recently trying to acquire ARM. And so we have to have the government acting in concert with itself to ensure that our competitiveness posture is very, very well positioned going forward. So I agree with you 100% in terms of,
I know. And what a great next project for Congress to undertake.
Yep.
Is fine-tuning precisely these policy points.
Mhm.
And Edlin, maybe to pick up on that stream of thought you were just elucidating,
Sure.
one of the most controversial aspects of the respective pieces of legislation, especially the America Competes Act in the House, is its provisions for foreign investment screening. Certainly, it does seem to be reasonable that there would be cases, for instance, where U.S. companies are forced to make a joint venture inside China, which would merit the government assisting our companies not to have to be forced into such arrangements. But of course, it makes little sense for a government to review every outbound investment a U.S. firm might make. So if the legislation is to include provisions on foreign investment screening, how do we get this right in a very narrow and tailored way?
Yeah. Stephen, I think Mike also has thought very deeply about this. So I want to hand over to him very quickly. But, from the perspective, again, a lot of the policies in terms of near term, looking closely at foreign investment, to some degree, some would argue foreign investment is a good thing because it's a capital infusion into, say, U.S. technologies and so forth. It becomes a bad thing when it is related to a government's control and obtaining control of U.S. technology. And that is what wholesale China has been doing in terms of their foreign investment into U.S. technologies. And that's where we need to be incredibly careful in terms of looking at the types of investments that are being made and actually, preventing the investments that would enable a transfer of U.S. technology to a potential competitor nation. I'll say it is challenging. The same way that I mentioned export controls are meant to protect U.S. technology, but can actually hurt U.S. industry. From a venture capitalist perspective, a lot of U.S. startups are actually moving their operations outside of U.S. territory, either to Canada or the Cayman Islands or so forth, because they want to avoid the type of restrictions that the U.S. government puts on them. And that's a bad thing. So we need to figure out, how do we solve for the not wanting, right, the prevention of technology acquisition by a foreign government through infusion of capital, while also enabling U.S. innovators to, at scale, gain the capital. And one of the things that we're pioneering, from the America's Frontier Fund, is to ensure that we can signal capital markets to invest in deep tech. Like Jack and Arthur were saying, it's not just about the digital technologies. It's not just about software as a service and enterprise software and e-commerce. It's actually what's the hardware that underlies those technologies that's going to stimulate the economies of the future we need to focus on. Michael, I know you've thought about this quite significantly, so I wanted to pause and.
Well, most of the thought and writing I've done is about Chinese investment into the U.S. But I think as it relates to outbound investment, we have to think about what's more important. Our capitalistic tendencies to want to make money, whether transactions are coming in or going out, or do we care more about what we're doing to support China's growth as the number 2 economy trying to grow to number 1 when they clearly have established themselves as an adversary? We haven't declared that they are without a lot of evidence that they are moving to undermine everything that we stand for and displace us as the technology superpower. So in my view, we need to recognize that the more important issue here is not that our financial institutions can make money, but that we need to protect the world order that we care so much about. And so there should be free flow of capital, ideas, talent among those countries with shared values, which fortunately includes much of the world. But with China, I don't really see a benefit for us allowing them to access our capital markets for their companies, all of which are in pursuit of their national goals and supporting their military. They have no choice. That's the way China's system operates. So why should we allow their companies to benefit from U.S. capital markets? Why should we allow U.S. capital to flow and support their economy? I think when you take a realistic look at where we are in the world today, it's hard to make that case. Imagine in the 1960s, if we were having a discussion about companies in the Soviet Union, would we have said, okay, it's okay for U.S. companies to make investments in the Soviet Union, given what they stand for? I think the answer would have been clear. It's just that we live in a world now where China has integrated themselves with the global economy that causes us to have a question here. But if you kind of look at what the countries stand for, the human rights record, the wanting to undermine us geopolitically, it really makes no sense for us to be supporting them investing in the U.S. or allowing U.S. to invest in China.
And I think the investment discussion then bleeds over into the research discussion as well. There is a solid intellectual argument to be made about basic research is benefited by global cooperation. And you could point to any technology today that is benefited because of global cooperation. I think we need to have a different conversation when we start talking about applied research in fielding technologies. And I would say, having talked with a number of the biggest companies in the United States on technology companies, I even sense a little bit of buyer's remorse about how open they were in working with some other people that are less enthusiastic about United States and Western democratic values. So I think we ought to, in terms of protecting our technologies, whether it's hardware, whether it's software, there is, in addition to the investment piece of this, a discussion to be had. Part of this bill, I think, will have that discussion in the open, is about how much research is acceptable in terms of global cooperation, and how much do we have to be a little bit more careful to ensure we're not losing our crown jewels.
And Jack, let me just pick up on that.
Stephen, I just may add to that, Jack's point, but that very often the person who's in the least informed position to make such a call is often a government official. That's one of the real challenges with export policy, is that it often leads to bad decisions because those who make the decisions, the bureaucrats, whether it's a Department of Commerce or elsewhere, at BIS, know that saying no is a lot easier than saying yes, and a lot safer. Now, I've seen this with the quantum industry, where international cooperation is essential for advancing the technology and development here. But the fact that we don't have a coherent export policy with regard to quantum, or and many other technologies, acts as a major hamper to development and precisely that kind of research and development cooperation that goes with it here too. So export policy, this goes back to Evelyn's excellent point. Export policy can be either a catalyst or it can be an impediment to advancing economic and national security. And getting a coherent export policy about so many of these technologies is going to be another next step from passage of the Innovation Act.
Great. As you reference quantum, Arthur, let me pick up on a couple questions from the audience. I'll read two, which I think you can answer at once. But question for Arthur Herman: is there applied research for quantum-hybrid? Do you see near-term research and commercial applications in quantum for national security? A related question asks: Senate bill has R&D money for 10 techs, including quantum, but House bill has the Quest money for quantum user access. Will quantum be in the final bill?
You're asking me if it's going to be in the final bill?
Yes.
I might. I don't know. I would imagine it will be in some shape or other with it. What I would say from the point of view of quantum and its contribution directly to both national security and to the Department of Defense's own objectives, probably Michael and Jack can give you some pretty good insight about that as well. What I would say with regard to quantum is that yes, it certainly is not a technology comparable with AI, which has a very large and well-established commercial base in which our national security players can basically pick and choose what kinds of aspects of AI and which technicians or which companies they want to work with here. Quantum doesn't present that kind of opportunity yet. However, your questioner does raise a very important point, which I think with the current administration sometimes gets lost. And that is the development of quantum technology is not something that's taking place or is going to take place somewhere out just beyond the horizon. That the timeline for the application of quantum technology doesn't stretch out 2 decades or 3 decades, as some experts say. It's happening now, and it's made possible by hybrid systems. The integration of quantum technology with conventional digital technology is the quantum future. Digital computers are not going away. Conventional computers will continue to have their use and will continue to accelerate the growth and applications of quantum technology as well. One of the things that I think we need to do is to really think about quantum's future as a real industry in America that creates jobs, that hires engineers, and yes, even in hires, it sets up manufacturing firms building the components for quantum communication networks and for other applications, as well as for quantum computers. I'm not aware of anything that has been addressed in any congressional bill that takes on that issue. That's more of a policy issue. I think that leadership needs to come from the White House in particular. But what I will say is that the quantum age, the advent of quantum technology, in my view, is coming a lot sooner than we realize. And the Chinese know it, and that's why they're investing somewhere close to 4 times what our government's investing in quantum technology. And it's definitely one of those critical technologies that Heidi has talked about that we really need to get serious about sooner rather than later.
Excellent. So one of the elements of the America Competes Act is a $45 billion program on critical supply chain resilience. Wondering, a questioner from the audience wonders if we have any thoughts on the merit of that program and the need for a critical supply chain resilience initiative.
Well, Stephen, I would just add here, Edlin's point is spot on. You can't disassociate the R&D from the manufacturing. And one of the things that, of course, we've learned from COVID is we cannot have a economic security in a world where we don't care where the parts and elements of the supply chain go through. So it's going to be important to make sure that we pair the investment that we're making in research with where are these technologies going to be manufactured. So I think that's what's.
And let me pick up on that for a second as well, Mike. So one element, of course, starting with the Endless Frontiers Act, is that it would create within the National Science Foundation a new technology directorate. Now, this would be a new function within NSF. Of course, the original Endless Frontiers Act called for $100 billion of investment. That was pared down to $29 billion for the 10 key emerging technologies in USICA. And as I understand, the House is now at $13 billion. But Jackie raised the point that the U.S. has long led in basic scientific research, but of course that creates a global public good that is freely appropriable by anybody in the world. And what we've really struggled with is the commercialization of that technology. The ability to capture the value add from the R&D in the United States. Maybe Jackie, you could say, why is the creation of this technology directorate so important, and to bring in this new functional element within NSF to drive commercialization and innovation?
Yeah. So when I talk about earlier the experiences I had with those 2 AI programs, this was a conversation we had fairly regularly. The last thing I would ever want to do is say, give me more money, but only at the expense of, say, basic research. My pitch to get funding for my 2 AI fielding organizations were, I need money for AI fielding. Let's treat that with the priority it deserves, but not at the expense of anything else. And I think it's the same sort of philosophy here, that this is not about sort of fratricide or eating seed corn within the NSF. This is designed to say NSF will continue to do this basic research, which has led the world, will continue to lead the world, and will do all sorts of amazing things. But at the same time, there has to be a greater appreciation for speed to market. Back to how quickly can I get these technologies fielded? That may have a hardware component, may have a software. It's probably a combination of all the above. Something Arthur said, which is so important. I think we'll see breakthroughs not from any given technology, not from any piece of hardware or any kind of software. It's the integration of these capabilities in ways I don't think we even are anticipating yet, which is why the research part is so important. So to me, it's about, if I were to pick anything, it would be 2 words: speed and scale. Speed to market and getting it across the entire United States of America, while allowing NSF to do what it does best on the basic research. Well, at some point, of course, we'll bleed over into the applied research side. But what we don't want to ever suggest is that one would come at the expense of the other. It's great for the NSF to have both. I think that would be how I would characterize this.
Stephen, I might add, though, Jack is spot on in terms of the importance of manufacturing and the role that the technology director can have. But I do want to map back also to what Arthur had said before, which is, government is not going to commercialize technology. It will enable commercialization of technologies through policies, and creation of a directorate within NSF does not. It goes back to what I said about what the Competes Act is and is not, what the CHIPS Act is and is not. It does not fundamentally address the fact that right now the economic competitiveness equation for manufacturing activity in the United States just does not compete with the rest of the world. And a technology directorate in the NSF is not going to change that fundamentally. If you think about the fact that, what I had talked about before, the corporate tax in the United States is non-competitive, that labor costs in the United States are non-competitive, that, there are regulations in the United States that are prohibitive toward manufacturing activity. We see that, from a company's perspective, be it a small company where you might be trying to scale a manufacturing process, or a large company where you might be investing to augment current manufacturing capabilities, you're not going to choose the United States today because it's not competitive. That needs to change, and that's not going to change with the current bill.
Yeah, I'd like to follow Edlin's comment here, because she is spot on. We need a complementary effort to what we have here in the Bipartisan Innovation Act to think about addressing U.S. competitiveness. So, drawn on my experience as a former Silicon Valley CEO, every incentive that a CEO has today is to optimize short-term profit, not build national capability. So we really need to think about that. We've developed our set of policies and laws in an environment where the U.S. didn't have competition. So a lot of this coming from the shareholder revolution of the 1980s, the Milton Friedman School, which kind of said, if we pursue profit, everything else will follow and be good. That's not necessarily true in an environment where we have adversaries who are significant economic powers. So 1980, as we were on our way to winning the Cold War, that looked pretty good. Post-COVID, in a world where a lot of supply chain goes through China, I don't think that's a smart policy. So we need to think about, if we want to really encourage development of national capabilities, the way China does by pulling all its instruments of national power together, we have to think about what are the capitalistic incentives? Do we need to reform the capital markets so that we're not focused on every last penny per quarter? That's the way CEOs are incentivized today. That's what's driven supply chains out of the US, that extreme focus on profitability. So believe me, I'm a capitalist. I think we should benefit from the system we've created. But government's role is to make sure that at the edges, we're making the right decisions. So not to move away from the capitalist system, but to make sure at the edges, we're still focused on building capability, not squeezing out that last penny of profit, which will cause us to make decisions that are not in our national interest. So that also needs to be addressed if we want supply chain resiliency, if we want to be building national capabilities. That's why the Bipartisan Innovation Act is a down payment. We're going to need to do more there, but we're going to need to complement that with some of the changes in policies here. It's a good, quick example, R&D tax credit. All R&D is not the same. Investing in new foundries is not the same as investing in the next dating app. It's different from a national capability standpoint. Why is long-term capital gains indexed to a year? What makes that a long-term investment? So these things need to be reconsidered in the current competitive environment.
Yeah, shockingly, a Business Roundtable study of American Fortune 500 CEOs found that 82% would cut R&D to meet quarterly Wall Street earnings targets. We need to think long-term in a much more serious way. I totally agree. Maybe to address the CHIPS Act briefly, a lot of the critiques of this legislation have been that, well, isn't the United States just copying China and what they're doing, like with industrial subsidies? And they point to the $39 billion of incentives. I think what people fail to realize is what China is doing is totally different. For instance, China provided $24 billion of industrial subsidies to stand up YMTC as a competitor in the DRAM memory space of the market from whole cloth. That's totally different from the incentives that we're envisioning in chips, $3 billion per instance to attract semiconductor manufacturing, and using those incentives to offset the types of incentives that other countries offer for cheap land, utilities, et cetera, to attract the semiconductor fab. Maybe Edlin or Mike, you could address, why what we're envisioning doing in chips is fundamentally different than, what China does with their massive subsidies of the semiconductor industry.
Do you want to go first, Edlin?
Yeah, okay, sure. I think the key point, which is different, is that the way that we've structured this bill is, again, meant as a catalyst, right? Stephen, what you've described China does and the approach that they do is a very, very heavy-handed investment in, to an extent, catching up, right? The vision for China that has been laid out, and for example, their Made in China 2025 plan is to ensure that, for example, 70% of their domestic market is addressed by, domestic capacity. And what they're trying to do is essentially create, a domestic autarky for their industry, right, where they have the full supply chain that has been onshored and domesticated. It's a completely different approach from the way the United States thinks about the supply chain and leveraging what Mike had said, the best that, the global industries can provide, that taking advantage of capitalism that is optimized across the globe can actually, ensure that there are much more efficient supply chains and ways to get to advanced technologies. The trick for the investment for the USICA, for the CHIPS Act, is to ensure that our is it 39 billion or 52 billion, acts as a signal to the capital markets as to what is important from a market generating perspective, which gets into, what Mike and Jack and Arthur have all been saying. It's not just about, the next, e-commerce or software as a service app, which is important to invest in. It's actually ensuring that our economy rewards the types of market growth investments that take sometimes, 5, 10, 15, 20 years to mature, when we think about, technologies, like how long did it take to, introduce new materials into a semiconductor process? That can be a pathway that takes, a decade long in terms of research, development, retirement of technology risks, and ultimate introduction into the high volume manufacturing sphere. Same thing with advanced, technologies in other areas, be it advanced materials for hypersonics and, airframes, or be it, quantum technologies and the types of, optics, laser optimization, cryogenics that are required to support those technologies. And so we think about CHIPS Act, it's different because it is meant as a catalyst to stimulate additional investment. It is not about catching up where the United States is behind. It's about continuing to lead in the technologies that are going to be at the frontier of information and communication systems in the future. So that's, I'd say, the key difference.
Yeah, I think I would just add that the Chinese approach is certainly to be very heavy-handed. So instead of the invisible hand, the hand is right in front of you, directing all government, academia, and business for national interest. And that goes to picking winners and losers, as Edelin talked about, standing up, different parts of the industry from whole cloth, tremendous land, capital, subsidies, on and on and on. Our approach in the U.S. is trying to build on the best of what we've done, signaling which industries are important. So this goes beyond the CHIPS Act as to what is the Bipartisan Innovation Act getting at. The kind of industrial policy we need in the U.S. is to recognize that technology is key for our future. So let's make sure that we signal which industries, which technologies are going to be important, and the incentives are there so that the capitalistic incentives then take over. So we're investing in those areas. We're not picking winners and losers of companies. We're saying it's critical for the semiconductor industry to be successful in the U.S. and the quantum industry and biotech, et cetera. So
Right.
that's where we need to bring instruments of government together to recognize that and benefit the private interests then that go make that happen.
Look, and then I'm going to say something that's a little controversial right now, but there's also another ingredient we can't neglect when it comes to the Chinese model for industrial policy or in technology policy, and that is it's a larcenous enterprise. I mean, a lot of the work that they've done has been stealing, right? The intellectual property and data that others generate and make. And the Chinese make no bones. They see it as theirs. What you make is ours. It's very much of the attitude on the part of government officials and also industry officials. I could tell you stories.
Christopher Wray at the FBI.
Certain telecommunications equipment companies in which the same view is that what you make or what you have as an American, as a Swede, as a French or Australian company actually really belongs to us as well, and we can help ourselves to it. There's nothing like that in the CHIPS Act. And as everybody has pointed out here, the CHIPS Act is not an unprecedented type of government investment in targeted technologies or research and development. This is a long-standing American tradition that goes back to the 19th century, actually, and that some of the most successful eras in American economy and in American society have sprung from precisely those kinds of roots. When we think about, again, World War II, arsenal of democracy, wartime mobilization. When we think about the race to the moon and the inflow of government subsidies and dollars into those technologies and the ripple effect it had on the economy. When we think of Semitech, right, another great model of how government could catalyze advancements and turn around the U.S. semiconductor industry in the 1980s. All of these are models for that the CHIPS Act, that the Bipartisan Innovation Act, that all of these follow through on in ways that, again, distinguish it very much from what the Chinese are up to and have been up to over the last couple decades.
I think we have to mention, since it's an ITIF forum, that Rob Atkinson, the president of ITIF, has written that it goes all the way back to Alexander Hamilton. We had an industrial policy at that time that focused on manufacturing, that we couldn't just import all manufactured goods from England. We, in fact, have a strong economy, need to develop our own manufacturing industry. A bit ironic that we're talking about that here with semiconductors today, that insight from over 200 years ago. But we've always had some form of industrial policy, even if we don't like to recognize it or call it by that name.
No, that's true.
And I should note that ITIF has stood up a Hamilton Center, whose focus will be to kind of accurately contextualize what the appropriate government role is in supporting American industrial competitiveness.
Hey, listen, if we're going to be taking Alexander Hamilton's name and bringing it as part of advertising at Hudson, we've had our Hamilton Commission, the Alexander Hamilton Commission, on securing the national security innovation base that my colleague Nadia Shadlow and I set up and have been generating reports on. The next one, by the way, Michael, is on space.
Great.
Space industrial base. And one of the things we want to do is to coordinate that with the efforts that DIU and AFRL and Space Force have been doing on space industrial base. So yeah, Hamilton and Vannevar Bush loom large in the historical background for all of our conversations here today. And it's important to recognize that.
Absolutely. I just want to briefly note one of our audience members asked how, if at all, will the BIA be important for small businesses? It's an important question. I will point out that it calls for substantial increases to the Hollings Manufacturing Extension Partnership to help the innovation capacity of our small manufacturers. It calls for increases in funding for the Small Business Innovation Research Program to stimulate innovation, especially coming out of U.S. universities. There's $10 billion, at least in the Senate legislation, for regional innovation hubs to turn regions of the country into innovation hotspots. So there's an awful lot of other important facets of this legislation to support small businesses and to stimulate regional economic growth. And ITIF has written extensively about that. We also did an event back in March called The Devil in the Details, where we compared the House and the Senate legislation on some of these industrial competitiveness pieces of funding and recommend that the conference committee should by and large steer towards USICA, at least on the innovation and R&D components of legislation. With about 5 minutes left, and I do want to wrap up at noon, so let me perhaps now put forward, which I've been saving for last, the very first question that we received from the audience. And that question was, it notes that we have the two bills in the conference committee now. Will they pass and when? And what will the final form look like? So I'll put that on the table. And I'll also add one final question. And that is, do you agree with my contention that other countries around the world are now looking at how the US Congress is going to act and behave over the summer with this piece of legislation and are assessing how serious America really is about its industrial competitiveness and ability to compete globally? How much is us getting this legislation done this summer a test for America's global standing in the world as well?
It absolutely is. And we can't let politics be in the way or the perfect be the enemy of the good. We need to make some progress now. And as we've all commented, this is just a down payment on things that we need to do to really seriously address the strategic competition with China and strengthen ourselves, invest in ourselves for the future.
Yeah, and I agree with Mike. I mean, I don't know what will pass, when it will pass, and what it will look like, but that's your business. But in terms of is the rest of the world watching? Of course they are, and I'll tell you, the country that's watching probably closer than anybody else is China. And if we don't get this right, that signal will reverberate across the rest of the world.
Edlin, maybe I'll let you have a say, and then Arthur will give you the last word here.
Yeah, sure thing. You know, one thing I want to say, the act is very, very important for the government to pass. But I think, as you've probably heard from all of us, you know, government action is not the be all and end all of U.S. competitiveness, right? It's the U.S. economy, it's the U.S. people, right? It's local governments, it's state governments. So, you know, for those of you who are on the call, yes, passing this bill, passing this legislation, getting federal government funding is important, but it is not going to be the only factor, the only variable in the equation of U.S. competitiveness going forward. It is going to be everyone working together, from, you know, state and local governments to private industry, for those of you who are calling in from industry, to academics, to, you know, from my part of the community now, also the venture capital and money managers. When we think about where we're investing capital, to also move money to areas where we see growth and competitiveness for the United States. You know, I saw some questions actually come in about Russia. One thing we've learned is that making a bet in an autocratic nation has a huge amount of political risk. So don't do it, right? Potentially consider the fact that investing in the United States is an investment in growth from a domestic as well as global perspective. And so I think that that's the key thing. The key thing that I'd take away is whether or not the bill passes, it should pass. It's good for U.S. competitiveness. But whether or not it passes, we're all in this together, and we all put our hats in the ring to ensure U.S. competitiveness going forward.
Arthur, you have the final word.
Yeah, pass this bill. It's a good bill, but it's only the first step. And I would pass this message on to Republicans and for those who will be directing events and legislation in the next Congress, is there's a lot to build on from this bill. And Republicans can still look great in the next Congress after January 2023. And with this bill in hand, they'll be able to work towards a bipartisan majority for the next steps that are going to need to be taken in order to bring American economy and our national security back in line where it should be in our competition with China. So this is an important first step. It's a landmark bill, but it's by no means the whole story. The last thing we want to do is to have this bill pass, everyone congratulate each other, and then say, well, in 5 years, we'll see how we're doing. That's not the way in which this bill should operate, or the way in which this bill's aftermath should be thought of.
Well, I think that's an excellent place to leave it. Allow me to thank our excellent panel for joining us today. I also want to thank our audience for being with us. And I want to note that video of this event will be posted on ITIF's website this afternoon, and encourage you to share it with others who can be with us this morning. With that, thank you all, and we look forward to continuing working with you to pass this very important legislation. Thank you.